I'm John Woodward. I'm with the Metro Atlanta Chamber. I appreciate y'all being here. Just to give a quick recap of the Metro Atlanta Chamber, certainly from Columbus, you might not be familiar. It is the Chamber of Commerce for the Atlanta region. The Atlanta region, in this case, is 29 counties, about 8,300 square miles, 23,000 square kilometers, about 6 million inhabitants. Columbus is not part of the metro area, but of course it's a great partner of ours. The chamber actually is one of the oldest chambers of commerce in the U.S., dating to 1859, before the Civil War. And I am in the Economic Development Division of the chamber. Do y'all know what economic development is as a profession? Folks here, basically economic development is the industry of recruiting and attracting businesses to a certain area, usually, and helping those businesses grow and expand. So that's what I do, and I specifically do it on the international side, which is why I'm speaking here today. Within our group, there are three tranches, three subsets: the ecosystem team, which is a team that focuses on specific industry sectors that are objectively strong. So, for example, you might have heard of fintech, financial technology, or supply chain logistics. Atlanta was founded on that. We have specialists on staff who focus on those. That is, they work to attract companies in that sector. The project management team is just what it sounds like. They really do a lot of the heavy lifting if a company comes in. And the global commerce team is what I'm on. That is, wherever this becomes cross-border, wherever this becomes international, is where my team gets involved. And again, I think that's why I'm here with this International Languages Day here. The global commerce team has the FDI component, foreign direct investment, which is my side. That is recruiting companies from overseas to come to this area. It has the outbound side, which is the converse of what I do. That is, they work with local companies here in the area that may be ready to expand overseas. So cross-border one way or the other. And then lastly, there's a global identity. I'll go into that a little bit later on. But that is to mark or to identify the global brand of, in this case, Metro Atlanta. What does it mean globally? From Columbus, you obviously have very strong impressions of Atlanta, good or bad. And even people in Dayton, Ohio, or Minneapolis, Minnesota will have an impression of Atlanta. That's not the case overseas. Many times overseas, they might not know what Atlanta is, or they might know in certain terms. They might know Gone with the Wind. They might know Coca-Cola. They might know CNN. They might know the Olympics. But there's not a consistent theme. So that's one thing we try to work on. As I mentioned, FDI is foreign direct investment. So we recruit FOEs. This is an alphabet soup. FOEs is foreign-owned enterprises, non-US based companies, companies that are based outside of the US. Obvious examples would be Mercedes-Benz, Porsche. Less obvious examples are smaller companies. You might use their products every day, but it's not a household name. But in any event, it's a non-US based company. We work to bring those into this area. Why? To economic development, to create jobs, to create opportunities for people coming out of school, and to do that in a sustainable manner, smart growth, we call it. Same holds true for outbound. That is, the companies that are here, we're not looking to outsource. If you've heard of outsourcing, that is, you take a manufacturing that was done here and you outsource it to a lower cost country. That's not what outbound in this case means. It means a company that's here, a thriving company that wants to expand, that means grow overseas. And if it grows overseas, the home company will grow, the home base will grow. Again, it's all about creating jobs. Trade and investment, I say there, is a two-way street. And global commerce, we think global commerce is a good thing. It's kind of got beat up lately in the political cycle you might read about, but global commerce in general is a good thing for both sides of the aisle there. What's my background? For some of the folks here might be curious about that. How did I get into this role? Well, on paper it looks very logical. It looks like I planned it straight down the way there. Spoiler alert, I did not. But on paper, it looks very logical. I went to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University because I had an initial interest in international affairs. I grew up with an interest in international affairs, and so I chose to go to SFS in Georgetown because that was obviously a principal international school. That's where I continued my studies in French, which I had been doing for a while, and I started studies in German. So the language component was early on, and it became part of my academia. I went to the University of Strasbourg for a year, for part of that, an academic year. Strasbourg, this is not Salzburg, not Sound of Music in Austria. This is Strasbourg, which is in Alsace, right on the border of France and Germany. It went back and forth between France and Germany several times between the 1870s and 1945. But Strasbourg, right there on the Rhine River, of course, has a very strong French and a very strong German component to it, which was one of the main reasons I selected that. I came back to Washington, D.C. I became an FX trader. I went to work for a foreign exchange firm. That is a firm that trades money. This was back before the euro. The euro, of course, is the main currency of Europe. Pre-euro, every country had its own currency. So the French francs, the Deutschmarks, Spanish pesetas, Portuguese escudos. It was actually a lot of fun, all the different currencies. And I was a trader of those currencies. So someone wanted US dollars for Spanish pesetas because they had to pay a bill in Spain, for example. But I got that job initially because of my French language. I didn't have to use the word surgeon, but I did work with the Francophone African Diplomatic Corps in Washington, D.C. Francophone Africa are the former French colonies in Africa. So Gabon, Senegal, CAR, Cote d'Ivoire, those sort of countries had their own currency. I was hired because I spoke French and could trade the currency with them. And I moved that on into more roles within that company. It was very exciting, foreign exchange, all sexy and cool and everything, but to be honest, it paid a pittance. And I was living in a very expensive city. So I decided to go get a graduate degree, the last refuge of a scoundrel. And I went to New York University Stern School of Business to get my MBA. I got it in international finance. Again, the kicker there is that continual focus on international. During that time, I went to HEC, Haute Études Commerciales, outside of Paris to continue the French study. HEC is one of the grandes écoles, one of the major universities in France. It's a famous business school there. It was great going there, and it's all well and good to see on my resume. But in the interest of full disclosure here for everybody, my greatest achievement there was a 40-page paper I had to write on the pricing of options, which is ghastly to do in any language. I did that in French. The paper had very wide margins and big graphs to take up space, as I imagine you all have done on some of your papers. And I got a double D. I did not know there was a grade of double D. Apparently it's just above failing. But I got a double D and made it through there. So clearly the pricing of options was not my strong suit. But again, the international focus was prevalent. I came back to New York, where I was living at the time, started work at a major real estate firm called Cushman & Wakefield. It was just as they were going through international expansion, Cushman & Wakefield worldwide. So I worked on helping them absorb some of these international companies. Then I moved on to economic development. I went from the commercial development side to economic development, which I've explained earlier. I eventually got down to the city of Richmond, Virginia, which is my hometown. Became the director there. It was great working for your hometown doing this work, but it was very myopic. You all have probably not had the great pleasure of working with local politicians. Hope there are none in the room here, but local politicians can be an interesting group. So I eventually came down here about a dozen years ago or so, specifically for the international opportunities and the macro, the larger scale international opportunities. So basically on paper, again, it looks pretty logical. It was a lot of hard work. I don't mention things like the graveyard shift I worked at a hotel from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., some things like that that are not as sexy and highlighting there. So there was a lot of work going into it. And a lot of it, frankly, was serendipity, just blind luck, which everyone has in equal amounts. The main consistent focus, though, was the internationalism, the global focus. And there's a thing we mentioned in our office. I'm cribbing this from the head of our group, the 10-10-80 rule. And I think it's relevant for you all here who are interested in languages day. The 10-10-80 rule goes like this. 10% of the people in the world do not care about international. They just don't care, couldn't be bothered. It's all local, it's all domestic, which is fine. They're out of the way. 10% really get international. That's what they're focused on. They're consistently interested in it, and they really know how to communicate and engage in that culture. And so they're good because they're progressive on the international side, productive. The 80%, though, the vast swath of people, are those people who think international is cool, it's sexy, it's shiny, but they really don't quite get it. And they're the ones who kind of get in the way sometimes when you're talking business. So what I'm assuming with the audience here, a lot of y'all are in the 10% rule of the ones who really get or want to get international. Because if you do that, you can really make a good career in this. So my two languages in varying degrees of competency were French and German, which is great for my day job. I do a lot of work in the EU, the European Union. France and Germany, of course, are the two leading countries, now that UK is leaving, the two leading countries in the EU. So it does a lot of work that helps me in my day job. But it helps in general, even if I'm talking with people who are not speaking French or German, and say Italian or Spanish, just to have that knowledge of a foreign language, that understanding of what it takes to know a foreign language, helps even when you're speaking with folks outside of that language. There's certainly different connections there. This is just my own anecdotal thing there. I notice on the business side, when I'm in Germany speaking to German business people who are looking to come to the US, which is my target market, they already have a pretty good understanding of English, and they're quick to switch over to English. Usually their English is better than my German, so they switch over to English pretty quickly. The French, not at all. The French, those who know French, if you say even one word in French, they will stick with French all the way through. And you better know your French, and which is because it's my more stronger language. That was fortunate, but it's interesting little idiosyncrasies there with the way people handle their languages. For me, though, as I mentioned, German actually was my third language, and I did not learn it from my first language, from English, which is my mother tongue. I learned it initially from French. I was living in Strasbourg, in Alsace, in France, and I was learning my German from a Frenchman who was a German professor. So to think about how that went through the mind process, I had to think about things like Fenster here. Fenster means window. He would say, the professor, Herr Otto, would say, das Fenster, the window. I had to think Fenster, Fenêtre, which is the French word for window, and then get to window. So it's frankly a very convoluted way to learn a third language if you're going for that. I do not recommend doing that. But that was kind of the path I did to do that. An interesting sidebar on this, though, that I would add, if I don't know if y'all heard the word fenestration. It's an architectural term, a building term. It refers to the layout of windows in a building. It's specific to certain sectors, but it's a neat little word to know. And of course, that's just one of gajillions of examples of how knowing a foreign language helps you even with your own language. Fenestration sounds nothing like window in English, but of course that's what it refers to, and it goes back to Fenster or Fenêtre. It's just a fun little gee whiz kind of thing I learned in etymology when you're learning your words. And on that note, as you're learning a language, knowledge of English grammar is critical. It helps tremendously to know just basic English grammar, because that you're going to transfer over as you learn the other languages. Hi, Tim. Thanks. This is something that, again, as a native English speaker, which I assume most of you here are, is something as you're learning the language can be a problem. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And in the interest of International Language Day, I'm stealing that from a Frenchman, from Voltaire, who I think initially coined that. But what it means is, and I was tremendously guilty of this, and still am in a large degree, is that second language, French, or that third language, German, is not my native tongue. I sometimes don't feel comfortable speaking it, and sometimes I will let that lack of comfort, that self-doubt, get in the way of actually communicating, and in my case, doing my job. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The people will appreciate you're making the effort. Certainly the French will, my goodness gracious. And the Germans will too, before they switch over to English. But they will appreciate you're making the effort. So even if you don't really know it, go ahead and try. You forge that connection. You make that connection with the client or the customer, the people you're talking to, the friend you're trying to make. And then interestingly, again, kind of like that fenestration example I gave earlier, I have found in my case, it makes the brain think in a different way. Because sometimes you want to convey an idea, but you don't know the word in that language, so you sit back in your brain and you think, what's another way I can make that point? And I can use words I do know. And it's an interesting sort of mental exercise that you go through automatically when you're doing that. Language skills help on the receiving end as well. It's not just you talking to someone, but when you have that foreign language ability, you think you're in the place of those other folks. And the example here is many times when I'm over in France or certainly Germany, I'm like, whoa, lentement, slowly, langsam. Please slow down a little bit as you're speaking, because they're speaking in their native tongue and they're going very quickly, and it's not my native tongue. And so I'm trying to say, go slowly so I can understand that. Well, conversely, on the other hand, when we have visitors coming here, they could be that new friend you made. They could be, in my case, a client or a customer, but they're coming in here. I am now aware not to speak very quickly, not to roll over things, not to roll over my consonants, my letters, not to speak in an accent. I work sometimes with some folks down from, not Columbus, but say down in Valdosta, Tifton areas. They got some accents. They got some accents. And they sit back, hey, welcome to Georgia. And these poor people from overseas have no earthly idea what they're saying. They even might speak English very well, but they can't understand them. So it helps you be aware how you sound to others, that knowledge of the language that you're speaking there. So you ditch your accent, you ditch your idioms. You know what idioms are? These are slang words like argot. Argot, in fact, is a French word for slang. So try not to use slang words. Try not to use idioms when you're speaking to someone, because that's what you would hope they would do when you're over there. And try to use that, it's basic language to convey that idea. It helps your guests, your visitors feel welcome. It feels relaxed. And again, in my case, it's a business. It's a means to an end for business. And lastly, kind of wrapping up here, and then certainly any questions y'all might have, what we look to do, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier in my first slide, what we look to do at the Chamber, one of our goals on the Global Commerce team, is to enhance the global fluency of, in this case, the metropolitan Atlanta area. And what does that mean? First of all, foreign language, any kind of language, whether it's French, German, Swahili, helps with this global fluency. So I'm not talking about fluency of the language itself. It's the definition right here. Here, the global fluency, it's almost a lowercase f, if you will. It's the level of understanding and competence and practice and reach of, in this case, a metropolitan area on the global scale. And by extension, that applies to its residents. So this is important for us, for business, and for you all too, who are all going out into the job world. When I'm out talking to the TIM bulldozer company in Stuttgart, Germany, and saying, come over here to Atlanta, we have a globally competent workforce. We have a globally fluent metropolitan area. They are more likely to come over to this area, and that means they'll come over and they'll hire us, they'll hire y'all, which again, going back to the beginning, is our goal. So learning the language, in this case, any sort of foreign language, helps with this sort of macro, this regional global fluency. It adds that internationalism. And the reason we have down here, the more globally fluent metros become, the better they can influence control their own destinies. That sounds very Darth Vader-ish. But the better they can really control what's going on. Globalism is kind of getting a bad rep these days from some folks and politicians in D.C. and elsewhere, not just in D.C., overseas as well. There's a lot of this me first, tribalism almost in some cases, independence, whatever word you might use. But globalism, is here. Globalism will be here. It certainly will be here as you all grow up. And the areas that are best equipped to handle it, that do not shy away from it, are going to be the ones that succeed. And if those areas succeed, that means the folks in the areas are going to succeed. There'll be more jobs for you all, more opportunities for you all, for companies coming in, or for you going overseas with your newly learned foreign language. I took this, I want to give credit to Brookings Institution. I took this from the Brookings Institution. That's their term, so I don't want to be sued for copyright on the camera here. But indeed, that's something that Brookings is working on. They call it the Global Cities Initiative, GCI, and it's something that we at the Metro Atlanta Chamber and the Atlanta region very much buy into, and we're working actively to enhance that. And the lastly down there, not Brookings, but my own JWW, my own addendum there. It used to be when I was watching late night TV, it was Jay Leno and whatnot. I think Jimmy Fallon might do it nowadays or something like that, but they have a funny little segment where they go out in the street and they ask people, you know, where is such and such a country, or can you name this or that? And usually it's a horrific answer. And everyone giggles and laughs like, oh, I don't know where Ohio is, or I don't know where Germany is, or something like that. I never find those segments funny. It's not, there are many things to laugh at. There's lots of good jokes out there. I've got some good ones and bad ones I could tell you after the talk here. But laughing at something like that, I always kind of cringe at that. And Americans are notorious for knowing less about geography, less about international affairs than others, partly because we're isolated and we're our own big country here, so that's not entirely our fault. But it's not a source for amusement, and the fact that you all are here for World Languages Day warms my globalist heart, because I think you guys have a different perspective already just by virtue of being here. So that's what I would encourage you to look at, and I think that pretty much wraps up my remarks there. I appreciate y'all coming on in and doing all that, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Can I make a couple of comments?
You certainly may.
Very good presentation. One thing, well, I work basically with the language department of Georgia State, and it's very important. I discuss with a lot of big companies, and what really happens is when you all get out of college, you're like a whole lot of other students, and one way you stand out is by being multilingual. And if you don't believe that, just pick up a box of Kleenex or Campbell soups or whatever it happens to be, and you'll see it's in multi-languages on these cans. Everything is multilingual. It's hard to find anything that is totally 100% American-made, American-generated, where you have no foreign contact. Even your grocery store, as I said, has all these different things. So everywhere you go. But part of the thing that I think with the language too is you have to understand that the culture and language go together.
Right.
And in order to, and you can't do one without the other. And if you want to interface, some things we think, as you mentioned earlier, are cool. They're not acceptable in other countries.
Right.
A good example is I live in France about 3 months a year. And if you're in a lot of cities, particularly New York, you stick your hand out in the middle of traffic to wave down a taxi. That's one of the rudest things you can do. And you don't go to a restaurant and say, two people for dinner. You say, good evening, sir, how are you today? And these things are all very important. And the culture and the way you deal with people are very important.
Yeah, and again, as my point earlier, that's very well stated. And I think learning that language helps you understand those cultures, helps you understand there is a difference there. And to your point there, I spend a lot of my time overseas. I do a lot of work in Europe, for example, and I'll travel maybe with a lawyer, an accountant. We talk to companies considering coming to the U.S., and we'll do a little kind of roadshow, and I have a different one for them. But the lawyer gets up and he says basically that. He says, we look like you. We might act a little bit like you, but we're not like you. And one classic example there, and it's true in French and in German, is the familiar version of you. Here in English, you don't have these. Hey, you guys. Hey, how are y'all doing? What's going on there? In French and in German and in several languages, there are two different versions of you. One is formal and one is familiar. And it's difficult sometimes to determine when you switch from that to another. And so these are little cultural things that's embedded in the language, but even a cursory knowledge of that language helps you appreciate that. Again, as I said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You might not get it all down pat, but the very fact that you have that and you're aware of it helps you with that interaction with those people you might be talking to. Is that fair on there?
So maybe before I pass the microphone around, maybe one comment that's very similar to this. It seems like what you do and what you've always done is all about human connection, right?
Right.
So it is really about building these relationships with people. And again, language is one form of it. And I'm really glad, Sandy, that you brought up the fact that you cannot separate language from culture, right? So even if your language skills may not be at the level where you could have a discussion or a business negotiation or something, still knowing enough of the language that you could approach the people, you could show your appreciation for the language, but then also know how to behave in certain contexts. I think that is so crucial. And it's what John, what you mentioned, I think is really important, is that especially with Europe, we think we're very similar.
You think you're the same, right.
And that is dangerous. I mean, when you interact with somebody, let's say from East Asia, you automatically assume, well, these people, they look different, you know that there's a completely different set of behaviors. But then you go to Europe and you think, oh my gosh, we're all Western folks, and how different can we be? Very different. I did a lot of training for Porsche, for example, and it's amazing when the Germans come over here and try to tell the Americans how to market their products. So it's quite amazing, right? So don't be shy, even if your language level is not what we would call fluent. It doesn't really necessarily matter. You can still build that human link, that human relationship with somebody. And that's really what it's all about. And that's what will also give you professional opportunities later on and make it possible for you to actually be a global citizen and be globally fluent, as John mentioned. So
yeah,
thanks for allowing me to kind of give my 2 cents.
Yeah,
so
sure, absolutely.
Pass the microphone around for anybody else, any questions?
Yes, ma'am. There you go. They need that for the thing, I think. But I think I can hear you. But well, okay.
Okay, yeah. The first question, I don't know if you answered this before, but could you walk us? I actually have 2 or 3. Could you walk us through a typical day that you have from start to finish, just real quick? And also, most of the students here are doing French. They're all doing French and Spanish. Is there something that they can do right now that could help them be more globally minded in addition to studying?
Okay.
And the third one is when they get ready to go to college, we're thinking about majoring or minoring in the language, but is there something else they can think about, maybe perhaps minoring? I know we talked about finance, but in addition to that as well.
Let me do this, if I may. That is be a little of a long response. I'm happy to do it. This young lady raised her hand, because she might have a real quick answer.
Sure.
So can we just toss over her, get her question first, and then I'm going to get to yours. Is that okay? Just because I want to. She actually showed up here almost first here. So
Okay.
hey.
All right. So I know you were talking about kind of your metalinguistic method that you use to kind of fill in those information gaps whenever you
Right.
don't have a certain word
Right.
for something. But I wanted to know, when were there ever times in your having conversation with foreign entities and maybe that communication just fell short? How were you able to cope and still build that connection that you talk about?
And that is a quick answer. I like that. It happens. And again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, with my 2 languages, French and German, when that happens with the Germans, they are, especially the ones who are already looking to come to the U.S., they almost always have a very firm grasp of English already. So when that happens, we switch over to the English because they're like, Herr Woodward, my English is better als your Deutsch, than your German, so let's just make it easy for everybody. The French, as I mentioned, they're going to hammer that down. I know you can get it. On peut y arriver. And so there you try and you go through what you can. As I mentioned in my remarks, it's interesting what your brain does almost without you thinking about it is like, okay, I want to convey this idea, and this is what I would say in English, right there. But well, let me say this, and let me there was one dedicated, for example. There's one I was in German, and I didn't know the word for dedicated, and we were talking about the streetcar here. He's actually saying the streetcar is so slow, and it doesn't have a dedicated lane. I didn't know dedicated. Besonder, a special, but it doesn't have its own special lane. And so you just try to think of different words. Synonyms. Synonyms are your friend. And again, they always, not just 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, they're going to appreciate that effort. And they're going to know. And then on the converse side, as I mentioned, when they're coming in here, bear in mind, many times they're going to be like that. They're like, oh, I'm trying to convey something here. And, you know, work with them, cajole, work, that sort of thing. But it happens. The main thing is don't get frustrated, which sometimes I would get, and just got frustrated, but just, you know, you keep plugging away. Thank you for that patience there. A couple things. One is a typical day. Well, let me do it in reverse chronology. Other things to do. Certainly the language is great. I view language as a means to an end, just as it is for English when you're speaking. Now, my mother was an English professor, so for her it was an end. But you know, you learn your English to convey ideas, to convey thoughts, to do that human connection, as you mentioned. Whether it's English or French or German or Swahili, that's the same. In my opinion, it's the same. It's a means to an end. The end for me is to conduct my business. And so what I would suggest there, to your third question, is if you're looking at a minor or some other subject to study in addition to that language, and I think we had some here. We had some doing international affairs, international politics, and try to find one that will be of interest to you and that, frankly, as my parents would have said, you know, is going to help you get employed. A utilitarian thing. As I mentioned there, mine did finance. My double day at HEC clearly indicated finance was not my forte. I was able to parlay that into a career anyway with a little cajoling. But try to find one, just as you would with your major one, your primary one. What interests you? You want to be happy in what you're doing. So try to do something that's going to be of interest to you. Keep up with the language. And in my opinion, unless you're going to teach that language, unless you're going to be a professor, and of course some are, it's a means to an end. So does that, kind of a generic. The first question was my typical day. The second one was, let's go to reverse order. Well, one thing, coming up from Columbus to Language Day at Georgia State University in downtown Atlanta, thumbs up for that one. Whoever, did you bring them up? Is that here? Or thumbs up on that. That's great. There's going that extra step is fantastic. Because going back to your point, it can get frustrating. And people sometimes will give up on language. They won't go that, if English is your mother tongue, English is everywhere. It's really easy to speak it, and conversely, it's really frustrating sometimes to learn another one. Which, by the way, is not the case over in Europe. I know it's very impressive when, a Dutch person can speak 5 languages, or 4, yes, there's no question, that's impressive. German, English, French, Dutch. But frankly, the Netherlands is basically almost the size of 2 Atlantas. And so they have no choice but to learn it because they're surrounded by Germans and French and English everywhere. So here in America, we're not. It's really, really easy just to stay in your English cocoon. And so it does take that extra effort for Americans to learn that language. Doing things like coming here is one. Being dedicated to it, as I mentioned. When I went through my sort of resume there, the one consistency there was that interest in international. That 10-10-80 rule I mentioned earlier. Be that 10% that truly takes international seriously. And that will help in that regard. Typical day, the very first part, I'm gonna dodge that question by saying there isn't one. I don't go in, I don't punch the clock, sit back like Lucy and put the cupcakes on the conveyor belt. And I'm really dating myself with that reference in case anybody might get that one. It's a classic scene, by the way, in case you want to YouTube it or something. But there's not a typical day, which, by the way, going back to your thing about a job, I encourage that if you can. Try to find a job that's not a typical day. You don't have a typical one. Now, when you're first starting off, that's going to be tough. My very first job was putting people in a log flume at a theme park, at an amusement park, and for $3.35 an hour and telling them to keep their arms and legs inside the boat at all times. That was punching a clock and very straightforward. So I'm not saying you're immediately going to do it. But try to go in one that, again, like the major question or the minor question, keeps your interest. So for me, I'll go in. First thing I do in the morning, of course, I have a lot of emails to answer because many times they're coming in overnight. Certainly with my Asian connections, my Asian customer, my Asian prospects, that's 12 hours. Generally, China's 12 hours ahead. So it's exactly, here it is 1:30 here now. It's 1:30 in the morning in China. And then European ones, of course, they're 6 hours ahead usually, UK 5. But, so they're going to come on in. So when I wake up in the morning, I've got a slew, if I'm doing my job right, I've got a slew of emails that I need to start answering because they've come in during the nighttime. And then you go through and mine's a project thing there. I might do that widget company out of Germany that I'm working on or something like that. When I travel overseas, some people say, oh, it's so lucky you get to travel overseas. Not you get to, we were joking about this earlier. You know, I have yet to find a client or a customer in Bora Bora or in the Maldives. You know, I go off to Manchester, England, with all due respect to Manchester, in case anyone's, or I go off to Dusseldorf, all due respect to Dusseldorf. You know, I mean, I'm going to business areas. And generally, frankly, I'm traveling in November or February, never in June or July, by the way. I never travel in June or July because that's when all the tourists go. So, you know, I'm not going over because it's fun, exciting to do. It's my job. And so a lot of the work I do there, I've got 2 trips coming up, for example. It requires a lot of planning, a lot of work to plan those trips. So I'll work with people overseas. One little thing that talk about culture, and you mentioned some of the simple things like hailing a cab or something. One thing that Americans are notorious for not being able to do, and I would not expect you all coming up from Columbus to have done it, maybe some folks here at Georgia State, is, you know what I'm going to say? Dialing internationally. Dialing internationally is something that over in Europe and in other countries they're used to doing. Every country has a country code. Our country code is +1, is 1 because basically we invented the telephone. So our country code is 1, and you're used to dialing 1-404, 1678, blah, 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 whatever. You're just used to it. Well, that's actually our country code for the US and for Canada. All other countries have a different code. South Africa is 27. UK is 44. France is 33, I think. So you have to dial, and Americans are notoriously bad at dialing internationally. So these are little things, little nuances that you ask, what can you do? I mean, even something like that is going to help you. It sounds silly, but something like that, and it's something that Americans just don't think about doing, again, because we're really big, and we're surrounded by ocean on 2 sides, and we can do what we want to do. So we don't have to learn these things, and other people do. So on a daily basis, I'm making phone calls. I'm doing emails. I'm trying to achieve these objectives with my team, with my partners, with my colleagues. That's a nebulous answer, but it's kind of what it is. Yes, sir.
But there's a good thing for students to use. It's called YABLA, Y-A-B-L-A. And it's a 3 to 5 minute, oh, I'm sorry. And it's a 3 to, gotta push the button so much. Oh, it's on? Okay, and you have to, it's a 3 to 5 minute little clip, and it's very often with students, and they'll discuss something cultural or a location and things like that, and then you can get it with, it's the one that I'm familiar with are in French, but I believe they also come in Spanish. It's got it in French and then subtitles in English if you want, and then afterwards you can do a little, test to see if you're really, it's to pick up the understanding and you pick up the culture end of it, of what's important to them and how they do it, because that's tremendously important. Can I give another little tiny thing?
Sure.
Very interesting, when McDonald's came to France, they cookie cut what they have here. It did not work. Matter of fact, in one of the small towns, one of the individuals took a bulldozer and leveled the McDonald's. He got elected to the National Assembly after doing that. I think his name was Saint-Empire or something to that effect. So it's very different. Then what they did is they just closed the McDonald's. They hired a French management team, and it's nothing like ours. There's no such thing as a drive-in, but there's all walk-ins. They've got comfortable chaise lounge. They've got widescreen TVs. There's no rush. They expect you to stay there for hours. And got great Wi-Fi, and they serve beer and wine. So yeah, again, it's a cultural thing that you have to do.
Well, one thing that might be from mechanical thing, just little things you can do. For example, you might have mentioned that with that program you mentioned. If you're interested, watch either a foreign movie and hear what they do, or even, frankly, when I was, what helps with even like German, for example, and things, watch an American movie with the subtitles and read the subtitles, and even watch a movie that you really know. I mean, like for example, I hate to say this, but I'm a big fan of Family Guy. I know, whatever, right? I'm up here in the suit now, I watch Family Guy. I actually went to school with the guy who plays Cleveland, as a matter of fact, that's why. But And I know every episode of Family Guy inside and out. My wife goes crazy about this. But actually, I can see when you're overseas, they actually run Family Guy. And it's in German or French or something like that. And I know the episode inside and out. You know, those things you just watch over and over again. And I know the lines. And then I hear it there, like, oh, now I got, you kind of pick up that way. So you pick it up like that, either orally, A-U-R, orally, or pick it up, read the subtitles. And you follow the subtitles, and you kind of learn it that way. That's just it's an easy way to do it. It's not in lieu of, instead of French, again, and not in lieu of learning vocabulary the traditional way, or from these programs you're mentioning, but it complements with an E. It helps learn some of those things.